the council of Shrewsbury had been told that they'd got to get all the rough sleepers off the street. So the guy in charge listed every hotel and B&B, including the Prince Rupert. And his colleagues laughed at him and said, there's no point going to the Prince Rupert, it's a 4-star hotel. And when he went to see them, not only did they say, yes, we'll take some, but then they said, well, how many have you got? And he said 30 to 40. So they said, well, we'll take them all. So he was astonished.
Now, we've been talking about the Tory leadership candidates. My next guest, Christina Lamb, is no stranger to conflict and chaos. She's been trapped in trenches by Russian tanks, with the Mujahideen ambushed by the Taliban in Helmand province. Excuse me, I knew that was going to happen. And present on the bus where the 2007 Kharsaz suicide bomb attack took place on former Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. During 35 years, she's worked as a foreign correspondent. Sorry about the background noises. I'm sure we'll eliminate them in a moment, and my coughing. Her work telling those vital stories of vulnerable people caught in the crossfire has not gone unnoticed. She's won over 16 major awards, been appointed an OBE for her services to journalism, and written 10 books, including the best-selling The Africa House and I Am Malala, co-written with Malala Yousafzai. Her most recent book is centred on that unprecedented year in our global history, the coronavirus pandemic in 2020, which saw populations across the world go into lockdown. The chief foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times found herself moving into the Prince Rupert Hotel in Shrewsbury, a 4-star hotel which chose to house 33 rough sleepers, transforming the lives of both its temporary guests and the hotel's staff. She tells all in her book, The Prince Rupert Hotel for the Homeless, and I'm happy to say joins me now in the studio, in the flesh, as it were, in a very nice summer dress. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you, Mariella.
Lovely to have you back.
Lovely to be here.
It's a really heartwarming story of compassion. It also, in a way, covers the same theme as much of your previous work, which is giving voice to the voiceless, people reduced to statistics, perhaps. So did you feel that you were making a great leap by reporting on this story, or did it feel very familiar territory?
Well, it's the first time I've written about my own country, so that was very different. And as you said, it was because of COVID, I couldn't travel. And suddenly I found myself becoming a home news reporter. And so one of the things I reported on was this Everyone In campaign that the government launched, which was basically to get all rough sleepers off the street by the weekend, because it was felt that they would be much more vulnerable to COVID, but also that they might spread it. So it shows actually that if you have the will and the money, you can solve homelessness, because they got everybody off the streets very quickly. Of course, things haven't continued.
I think we'll go on to talk about how that worked out in the end, because it's not necessarily a story with a fully happy ending, is it? But what was it about this particular situation that appealed to you? I mean, it's really incongruous in a way. Tell us a little bit about the Prince Rupert Hotel, which I think was owned by a man who used to manage Sandy Lane Hotel in Barbados. Best known for sort of guests like Michael Winner and so on. So it really does seem an unlikely story for him to then be taking in homeless people as the pandemic closes in.
Absolutely. So what happened was most of the rough sleepers were put in budget hotels and cheap bed and breakfast hotels. So I had reported on that. And then I heard about this hotel in Shrewsbury, the Prince Rupert Hotel, actually spoke to the manager, who told me, in fact, they ended up having more than 100 homeless people in the hotel. So I Googled the hotel, and to my surprise, it was a 4-star luxury hotel with kind of knights in armour and 4-poster beds and chandeliers and a decanter of sherry at the reception.
Not
it
just
was really
Tudor,
different.
but I think bits of it dated back to the 11th century.
Exactly. So I was really intrigued. So I went to go and visit them and met basically Mike Matthews, who's the owner, who had been manager of Sandy Lane, as you mentioned, and also his two, what he calls his right-hand women, Jackie Law, who is the accountant, and Charlie Green, who is the manager, all moved into the hotel during COVID, during lockdown, to look after these homeless people. And the reason that the hotel took them in at the beginning was Mike kind of panicked when he saw that hotels were going to be closed down. And he said, for a hotel like that, a really historic old hotel, you can't just sort of lock it up and go away, because all the pipes would seize up and things would go moldy, and snails and things would come in. And so he was desperate to find a way to keep the hotel open. So he was sort of offering it to all sorts of people. Nobody wanted it. And then the council of Shrewsbury had been told that they'd got to get all the rough sleepers off the street. So the guy in charge listed every hotel and B&B, including the Prince Rupert. And his colleagues laughed at him and said, there's no point going to the Prince Rupert, it's a 4-star hotel. And when he went to see them, not only did they say, yes, we'll take some, but then they said, well, how many have you got? And he said 30 to 40. So they said, well, we'll take them all. So he was astonished.
And what's interesting about it is, I guess in a way, it wasn't initially an act of philanthropy. It was an act in order to save the business, as it were, save the building.
And actually, to be honest, they knew nothing about homeless people. And Mike is the first to admit that he would walk past people in doorways and think, why are they there? Why don't they get a job? So he wasn't really necessarily sympathetic, but once all these people started moving in, and of course, many at the beginning arrived really smelly because they'd been living on the streets, they couldn't wash, they weren't used to being in those kind of surroundings, so they were also a bit nervous. Some of them didn't come out of their room for days because suddenly they had this nice room and a TV.
Flat screen.
So, it was quite difficult at the beginning, but they became this sort of dysfunctional family.
Before we talk about the homeless people who came in, let's talk, because Mike obviously had a vested interest. He owned the building, and he wanted to keep it up and running and functioning. But what about Jackie and Charlie, his right-hand women? Because actually in the book, it's them I was struck by more than anything. They sacrificed so much to move into the hotel and take on what must have been, quite a scary situation in some ways. You don't focus in on the fear that much, but I would have imagined in that
amazing.
situation.
I mean, Jackie in particular, she was the accountant, and suddenly she's dealing with heroin overdoses, and because a lot of the people that moved in were very complicated. Lots of them had suffered abuse. Many of them were alcoholics or drug addicts or had mental health issues. And so, hotels are used to dealing with difficult guests often, but this was really challenging.
Oh, well, that was the other thing, because they were determined to treat them as guests, weren't they, as well? It wasn't a kind of, look, there's a roof over your head now, off you go. They were being given hotel service.
No, absolutely. That's what's really different to most of the other hotels that took people in. In this case, Charlie was cooking these amazing roast dinners. She made afternoon teas with sort of scones and jam and cream and Prosecco, and made everyone birthday cakes. And so she insisted that we will treat them like regular guests, but with hugs. And she, the most incredibly warm person who'd gone through a lot of personal crisis, actually, and which she felt that looking after the homeless guests really helped her.
And, you're painting a wonderful kumbaya picture of them all together in this house, just rubbing together and getting on with it. But was it always like that? And was there ever a moment when the staff thought, this is too much, we're out of our depth?
I think there were many moments like that, particularly Mike, who would sort of go to bed thinking, my God, what's going to happen to my hotel? That, these people were trashing the rooms. Lots of spoons disappeared because people were using the spoons to heat their heroin. They had endless floods because people were running baths to create lots of steam, because that meant that the drugs worked quicker. And so often water would start pouring through the roof in this very ancient hotel. So, yeah, many times he was like, what have I done? And no, it was not easy. And, there was a lot of tragedy. I mean, people died. They had lots of issues with people overdosing. But there were also funny moments. I mean, they had people complaining about the gravy not being thick enough. Mike would say to Charlie, this is the biggest armed robber in Shropshire is complaining about your gravy. They had people posting reviews on TripAdvisor about their hotel. So, but in the end, they became this sort of family, and it helped them understand a lot about homelessness and look at homeless people very differently. And that was the sort of attraction for me to do the book too, which was I usually embed with armies, right? And suddenly I was embedding in this hotel with all these homeless people. And living with them 24 hours a day, so they couldn't really escape me.
And how long did you bubble with them? Because you were basically in a COVID bubble with the residents, weren't you?
I went 3 times. So I was there the first time, I think, for 3 weeks, then for 2 weeks, and then for a week in different lockdowns, and got to know some of the guests very well. Some of them were very wary because they, used to, frankly, being sort of spat at and treated badly, and felt that the media didn't portray them in a fair way. Others, really wanted to talk and liked the fact there was somebody who wanted to hear their story. And, they all had fascinating stories, all different. And some of them, literally one bad thing had happened, like, they'd suddenly lost a job, or they'd been kicked out by their girlfriend and got into a spiral, and all of a sudden they were living on the streets, something that they'd never imagined. Others had been on the streets for decades.
I know. You write about one man, I think, who'd been on the streets for 35 years, which is sort of hard to imagine.
It was also one of my favourites was a guy called Simon, who looks like Father Christmas, has his twinkling eyes and big white beard, and he really likes cathedrals. So he chooses to live. He says, my nightmare would be to live behind 4 walls. Although I noticed when in the TV room, he spent most of his time watching property programmes, which I thought was very funny. But he says, people call us rough sleepers, but I don't sleep much and I'm not rough. So he would basically move around the country, be interested in going to a different cathedral. He'd just come from Wells Cathedral, or he said he'd like to go to Ely because he'd heard that was a good cathedral, and he'd go and sleep in the churchyard.
Mike was very much hoping that he'd be able to in some way participate, I suppose, as you would, in some form of rehabilitation for people, and that everyone would emerge out of it better, and they would be able to change lives. Was that your experience of what happened, or his experience?
Well, it's not a fairy story. It's very challenging. And, at the beginning, let's be honest, as you said, he wanted to keep his hotel going and thought it would just be for a few weeks. Like all of us thought at the beginning that lockdown would just be a few weeks, that it'd all be over. In fact, they had the homeless guests for more than a year. And they then, once they realised it was a more long-term thing, got really into, well, maybe we can change the lives of these people if we give them love and give them a roof and give them good food, and we can turn their lives around. But they discovered that it's much more complicated than that. And that, in a way, is the sad thing, that this feels a bit like a lost opportunity, because they did everything they could, but they didn't really have the support from the services to help the people deal with addictions and mental health issues, and that was frustrating for them.
As a country, we're facing a homelessness crisis. I think 1 in every 206 people currently living without a home. Did it? I'm sure it did. How did it make you reflect on the UK's attitudes and, more importantly, maybe policies around homelessness?
Maybe angry. We're 5th, 6th most affluent country on earth. Why should we be having all these people living on the streets? And yes, there were a few that whatever you did probably would always be on the streets because they just were really complicated. One of them introduced me to himself as HLH, hard to love homeless.
Oh, no.
But others, just really needed some support and a chance. And it's really difficult to get out of homelessness. I mean, I had no idea how difficult the system was to register to find housing, and how, particularly if you're a single white male, you're right at the bottom of the chain. And it's a real challenge. It's somebody described it to me as like sort of, weekly misery contest. Who can be the most miserable to qualify to get the housing? And also just to see that, I'm afraid, like so many people, often just used to walk past people who are standing in doorways or sleeping in doorways. We're always in a hurry. You can't be bothered to try and find coins or to sit and talk to people. And so actually spending that time in the hotel and getting to know all these people really changed my view. And I can tell you, earlier this year, my father died. And the first people to reach out to me when I put something on Facebook were some of the homeless people that I got to know there. And they were immediately saying to me, call any time, any help that you need. And I just thought, that's amazing, because one of the things I realized talking to them was that one of the biggest issues that most of them had was, we all go through bad things at different times, but most of them didn't have that sort of support network of family and friends that most people have. So they'd had nobody to help them in difficult times.
You clearly have an insatiable curiosity. I think this book is just the latest example of you being led down a sort of rabbit hole by a story, because you just want to find out more. And I understand that you were quite a free spirit as a child. So is that when it started?
Yeah, I guess so. I was always in trouble, actually, at school, but I always wanted to travel and see the world. And I grew up in a sort of suburb of London, which was not a very interesting place, more than the most southerly stop on the Northern Line. And then we moved to a place called Carshalton Beaches. And I always felt that there were much more interesting places to be than either of those places. So,
why were you always in trouble at school?
I think I was just very rebellious and was a bit bored and wanted to kind of go out and do other things. And yeah, so I just felt that there was more interesting things beyond the school walls.
But then you went on to Oxford University, to study chemistry. Why did you choose science?
Oh my goodness.
It seems quite an incongruous choice for what you carried on to do later in your career.
So I was at one of the last grammar schools, and it was an all-girls school. And if you were bright, they really pushed you into doing science, because they felt that more women should go into science, which is right, I think. But actually, my best subjects were not science, nor were they my favourite
But not Christina Lamb.
So I ended up doing chemistry, physics and maths A-level. And then when I applied to university, realised actually I didn't really like any of those subjects. Chemistry was the least sort of objectionable to me. And you can't, apply to do English with chemistry, physics and maths. So I was lucky because I got into Oxford and was able to switch subjects. So I switched to PPE, which was quite dramatic change, and also is a subject which I think many people now blame for the ills in our politics, because many of our former politicians and prime ministers, although not Boris, did PPE. So
can you see what they might have learnt in that during that period that would set them on the wrong path?
I think you learn in PPE to be able to bullshit basically about anything and write and talk about all sorts of different things without actually having studied very much. So, I loved being there, and it's where I always wanted to write, and I got involved in the university newspaper and ended up editing it. So that's how I really got into journalism.
I can't believe I have to apologise for your language. It's
Sorry.
normally me who's in trouble, but sorry for that brief, well, I don't even know if it's not even a swear word, but I know some people might be offended. You said that you were interested in journalism, you got into student journalism and everything. You then worked at the FT, and I think that's when you had first a thirst for foreign reporting, or at least were allowed to go and do some foreign reporting. And you've said that your secret weapon, in a way, was your innocence and naivete at the time, because it gave you fresh eyes, perhaps. But was that a welcome viewpoint, or was it considered, a sort of an anomaly?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I got into foreign corresponding by accident, really, because I went to the FT to intern. And one day I was sent to a lunch of South Asian politicians, which the foreign editor was supposed to go to and last minute couldn't go. And he said to me, "You're always going on about India," because I had this dream of being Delhi correspondent. So he said, "Why don't you go?" And I sat next to somebody at that lunch who was the Secretary General of the Pakistan People's Party, which was the party of Benazir Bhutto, who was then living here in exile. And he asked me if I'd like to interview her. So, of course, I said yes. And I went to do this interview. And the day that I did it, her apartment was absolutely full of bouquets of flowers because she'd just got engaged to Asif Ali Zardari. So it was very timely. And then she went back to Pakistan. I got a job at Central TV as a trainee news reporter. One day I came home from work and there was this most beautiful gold inscribed invitation on my doorstep, and it was to her wedding in Pakistan, which I'd never been to, and was, of course, the most amazing introduction to Pakistan, because South Asian weddings tend to go on for long and be very colourful, but her being this great daughter of a leading politician was absolutely
epic, I
yes,
guess.
it was, and also very political, because after all the ceremonial events, there would be these discussions with her political colleagues about how to try and topple the military dictator, General Zia. So I was just fascinated. I mean, the most dangerous thing I'd ever done at that point was finding my way home late at night from a club in London after the trains had stopped. So meeting all these people who had been tear gassed, tortured, arrested, jailed for trying to bring democracy to their country, I thought was just fascinating. So I gave him my notice at Central TV and went to live in Pakistan.
And that was the beginning
was it.
of this trajectory across the world. I can't let you go. I can't believe we've run out of time, because there's so many things I still want to ask you. But I can't let you go without talking about Afghanistan, because you were coming on the programme. I just thought this morning about all the stories that disappear off the front pages, but they continue, in terms of the real lives of the people involved in them. And I wondered what your impression is of what's happening in Afghanistan at the moment, because it's not in the headlines, but I dare say it's not in a very good state.
It's heartbreaking. I mean, to have seen what's happened there, and in particular to the girls. I mean, the girls, as you know, can't go to high school in Afghanistan. It's the only place on the planet where that's true, and women cannot work except if they're in hospitals or teachers. And so all of these people who had dreams, like, to do things like the rest of us do, they shouldn't have been dreams, they should have been reality, overnight suddenly found that they can't do anything, that they're stuck at home. And it is just so soul destroying. I mean, lots of my female friends there say to me it would have been better if the West had never come, because they created these dreams and have shattered everything. But also the humanitarian crisis, and people, you'll have seen the reports of literally having to sell their children, to sell their kidneys just to try and be able to feed the rest of their family. It's really an awful situation, and it's, I'm afraid this is the problem. We don't seem to focus on more than one thing at a time. So Ukraine is sort of, much as it's important that we cover that, has sort of sucked away the interest from Afghanistan. I just came back from Syria. That's not being covered. But I am going to Afghanistan very soon. It will be a year since the Taliban took over, it's still a complete pariah state. It's not been recognised by any country on earth. And it's a really terrible situation for people. Only 4% of Afghans are getting enough to eat, according to the UN.
You mention words like soul destroying, I just wonder, these are not just statistics, as we said at the beginning. These are people that you've met and talked to, people that you know quite well, even people that you consider friends whose lives are, so directly impacted there. My good friend Don McCullen always talks, and I always accuse him of being a bit Eeyore-ish. He's the famous war photographer. Christina will know that, but just in case anyone else doesn't. And he talks about this sense of hopelessness, that his whole life's work, his bringing back of these images, his recording of what's happening all over the world has made no difference. I wonder how you deal with that sense, whether you feel the same sense of frustration and how you deal with the emotional baggage of leaving those people behind and coming back home to your son and your family life and your world.
Of course, that's the hardest thing in my job by a long way, when you pour your heart out writing something to try and make an impact that people will then do something about, and then nothing happens. And the people, and of course, what's changed a lot in the 30 odd years I've been a correspondent is that now we stay in touch with everyone because everybody's on WhatsApp, or even in sort of remote Afghan villages, people have got smartphones these days. And so, you'll write something and then people will message you back, what difference did it make? I was recently in northern Iraq in some of the Yazidi camps. They've now been almost 8 years in those camps since ISIS came and abducted so many of the women and forced them to be sex slaves, and they still can't go home. Most people have forgotten now. But, what keeps you going is that in all these awful places and situations, you find people doing the most amazing things that do make a difference. And just some small things, like this morning, actually, I woke up to a message from these 2 Afghan boys, the Yazidi boys, whose mother was one of the first female Supreme Court judges in Afghanistan, and she was assassinated last year. They shot her as she was going to work, and people might remember, she had a Mother's Day card in her bag, and there was all these bullet holes went through it, and so her 2 sons were orphaned. And so I kept in touch with them, and Helena Kennedy, the leading human rights barrister here, helped get them out of Afghanistan, because when the Taliban took over, they were really at risk because they'd spoken out a lot about how the Taliban had killed their mother. And so she helped get them out to Greece, but they've been stuck there for ages, and it was really difficult getting them to come here because this government isn't necessarily particularly helpful in bringing or allowing people to come here, as we know. And finally this morning they messaged me saying that they got here 2 days ago, that they're loving it, that they're at school and they love the school. So, okay, these are just 2 people, but I was so happy. So it's just small things. And I think maybe sometimes it's easy to get overwhelmed by all the horror that there is and think, we can't do anything. But actually, you can do small things. And if you can just help 1 or 2 people, that's actually, really worth doing.